Whatever the results are tomorrow, the time between Election Day and Inauguration Day seems to be a dark and terrifying 11 weeks in the history of the United States. However, perhaps there's some comfort to be taken into the fact that we have experienced fraught transitions before and longer ones too. When Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860 and prepared to take the reins from James Buchanan, who had kept the promise he made in his inaugural address not to run for a second term, we suffered through a 4 month slog of turmoil because until the passage of the 20th Amendment, which was amended in 1933, inaugurations used to take place in March, and during Buchanan's endless lame duck period, quite a bit went down. 7 states declared for secession, and Southerners had seized forts and garrisons, aiming themselves for the war we now know was coming. Which basically talked about civil war back then, but yeah. Um, well, people had spoke about the Buchanan and Lincoln transition with a historian named Susan Schulten, whose most recent book is A History of America in 100 Maps. People had wondered exactly the lame duck thought he was doing and what the incoming president could or couldn't have said or done to change the transition period's outcome. The conversation has been condensed and edited for clarity. Um, Susan Schulten was talking with Rebecca Onion, um, and they were going back and forth asking about questions during the 1860 election that set Lincoln up for his rough transition. The 1860 election was unlike any other because for the first time the contest wasn't only party versus party. Of course, there was a long history of robust partisanship in the antebellum era, but for the first time the country was also divided politically by section. The Democratic Party broke apart on sectional lines. They couldn't even agree on a single candidate in the summer of 1860, so the North went with Stephen Douglas, and the Southerners went their way with a guy named John Breckinridge, a pro-slavery states' rights pro-cession candidate, and of course the Repugs had no hope of getting any electoral votes in the South. They barely appeared on any Southern ballots. Um, In the post-mortem, even if you add up the electoral votes of the other three candidates, Douglas, Breckinridge, and the Constitutional Union candidate John Bell, Lincoln still prevailed. That's really important because part of the radical Southern um, position had to do with the fact that they considered the Repug Party illegitimate. By its party platform, radical Southerners considered it by definition hostile to slavery because the party, of course, was born out of the desire of Congress to regulate slavery. So the very outcome of the election confirmed to the South, particularly South Carolina, which ended up leading the secessionist movement, that it had no voice whatsoever. Now, Northerners would say, and Lincoln says something like this in his first inaugural address, get over it, we had elections, this is what democracy is. But basically, elections do have consequences. And right, but and which is right, but for the deep Southern pro-slavery ideologues, the election itself was unacceptable, and so the outcome wasn't a surprise to them. And as soon as the outcome was clear, they put their plans in motion. If you're paying attention, in the sense that you knew where the electoral college power was in 1860, it wasn't a surprise that the Repugs won. But in the aftermath of that, there was this interminable period of transition, 4 months. It must have felt like an absolute eternity. But what did Buchanan do during this time? What he did had tremendous consequences. What Buchanan did had tremendous consequences. He had this weird position, which is that he was against secession. He was a unionist. He didn't believe that the Constitution gave the Southern states the right to secede, but at the same time, he repeatedly made these public statements saying, "I don't have any power to bring these seceding states back, and I have no power to control federal forts or garrisons." So his actions seemed to belie his stated commitments. Some historians have said that as a result of what he did, the Confederacy started out far richer and far better prepared for a war. If we had a different person in office at that time who'd actually used a little bit of force during the lame duck period, it's not that he wouldn't have had a war, but it might have looked really different than it was today. You may notice that he routinely made it to the top of the list of the worst candidates that served as president. His administration was full of gestures toward the South. He tried to bring Kansas as a slave state. He actually meddled with the Supreme Court as it moved toward the Dred Scott decision. He was openly sympathetic to Southerners and had many in his cabinet who were not just Southerners, but had owned slaves. They were like slaveholders. At the same time, we think that the transition period, as he made these statements, he couldn't have imagined what would happen. He intentionally fuel secession? It's tricky. I think his ineptitude kept the secession conversation going, and he didn't just shut it down, which is not to say that he had the power to do that. If he had stood up to the South, Southerners might have just used force earlier. During that winter, Buchanan didn't think he had the power to forcibly protect the federal forts on southern land. So what happened along the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida, and Louisiana? That was even before some of those states declared themselves out of the Union. They used militias or local forces to take control of these federal outposts, and that way, our, our, our armaments were actually taken by Southerners long before those states even seceded. Here's another example of Buchanan's ineptitude. In January of that year, Buchanan got convinced by some of his cabinet that he should resupply the federal troops who had dug in at Fort Sumter and Charleston after abandoning Fort Moultrie to the secessionists in December. There were all kinds of cross signals, and the major at Fort Sumter didn't know the supply ship was coming, but Southern spies did. So they fired on it, and we focused on the crisis at Sumter in April under Lincoln, but there was actually this mini crisis in January. Some Southerners had said of the resupply attempt, that's the first act of aggression. The failed resupply was in early January, and then immediately after that you get the decisions by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and finally Texas to secede all in January and early February. The action on the part of Northerners looked like a perfectly legal, rational thing to do, and to preserve federal forts, but to the Deep South it looked like betrayal. The word that they used was coercion. For a long time, when the reigning theory among historians was that the war was avoidable, people looked at Buchanan and talked about his ineptitude, his gestures toward the South, but people also pointed to Lincoln and said he could have, in this long interregnum, been far more active towards soliciting the South. Personally, we see it differently. He was elected to a certain platform, and once he won, it's true he was not very vocal. He stayed in Springfield, made one visit to D.C., and then, of course, took his long train ride from Springfield to D.C. for the inauguration, but he was essentially saying, if you have questions, refer to my campaign, to the many statements he had made over the past 6 months. And we think in a way that was strategic, but because there were things on which he was willing to compromise and things on which he was not, the one thing he would not bend on was the extension of slavery into the West. No way would he concede that point. But that was the founding principle of the Repug Party, but that is one thing that Southerners by now were insistent on. I'm sure Lincoln was watching the furious activity in Congress where they spent months trying to come up with a compromise. Could he have been more solicitous? He did write letters. He wrote a letter to Alexander Stephens, who would become the vice president of the Confederacy, and who he knew from serving in Congress together, stating, there's really only one thing separating you and I, and that is you think slavery is right and should be extended. I think it's wrong and ought to be outlimited. But there's nothing else I would have said that threatens slavery where it is. He even went so far as to imply to some Southern leaders in private communications during this transition period that he would support the Corwin Amendment, a compromise passed by Congress that would have been the 13th Amendment, and that prohibits any interference with slavery forever. Of course, the president doesn't affect the amendment adoption process, but even he said in his inaugural address that he supported it. I think he thought that this would be an olive branch to the South. We think of this as such as a small circle of power is broken. But one thing I learned this year while teaching is that Lincoln had not met his vice president in person. He had not met William Seward, who became his Secretary of State. I don't think he had met Buchanan at any point. And since he spent most of the president-elect period in Illinois, it must have been very difficult. This was just the very beginning of the era of the telegraph communication that was nothing like what we have today. And one more thing to remember is that the Repug Party was only 5 years old at that time. Lincoln was a novice who had lost his last election for Senate against Douglas Seward, who was the real power broker, thought he would get the nomination and ended up actively trying to craft the cabinet in a party that would limit Lincoln's power. Because he was so inexperienced, Lincoln puts a stop to that. He grows in the office. But if you think about the coalition that makes up that fragile new Repug Party, it's radical anti-slavery activists, fringe abolitionists, conservative Democrats who don't think the South has the right to secede, anti-slavery Democrat, former Whigs, all these people in the coalition that Lincoln is trying to manage, and at the same time, and thinking, what the hell am I going to do with this court? He came into office elected on the platform of a party that's openly at odds with the Supreme Court, which had just issued the Dred Scott decision, so another conflict there. It is really important to remember that secession happened in 2 different waves. There was that first wave, and then a long period where nothing happened from February 1st through Lincoln's inauguration in March, and through to the crisis at Fort Sumter in April. 2.5 months and nothing happens. A number of southern states even defeated secession states. There were really positive signs that secession might have played itself out, and the Confederacy might have just been those 7 states. So when Lincoln was inaugurated, that affected what he said in his inauguration. He had reason to think that the Upper South will remain with him. That turned out not to be true, but it meant that he came into the speech making it very clear that he had no power to affect slavery where it existed, but also that secession was, in his words, anarchy, not just legal, but impossible. And if you think about it, right, he was putting it to rest. This is over for now, but for a lot of Southerners, he listened to that speech and saw it as a provocative and hostile, despite the conciliatory conclusion. The famous "better angels of angels of our nature" part, which Seward helped him write for something more forceful. But of course, now we know even that conclusion wasn't enough to bring back the Deep South or to stop what happened next. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rambin Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.